The rage of party is one of the most important moments in our political history that you have never heard of. It's also the subject of a new book written by George Owers that tells the tale of how a political culture war that raged over 300 years ago still echoes in the present. I'm Emma Trimble and this is GB News Originals. Now, before we get stuck into all of that, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our content. Now, George, can we just begin by you telling us a little bit about the background? What is the rage of party?
So the Rage of Party is a tumultuous confrontation which begins in the late 1670s, early 1680s. So that's late in the reign of Charles II. And the best way of describing it, at the start at least, is probably as in some ways an extension of the confrontation between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, between King and Parliament, as was seen in the Civil War earlier in the 17th century. So, to put it very crudely, the Tories were the party of the monarchy and the church, whereas the Whigs were the party that were more sceptical about the power of the monarchy and tended to represent the Protestant dissenters, who are essentially Protestants outside the Church of England, who are more radical Protestants and more sceptical about the claims of the Church's authority. So that's how it begins. And this flares up during a very important political confrontation, which is generally called the Exclusion Crisis, which is when essentially James, Duke of York, is the heir to the throne, who's due to Charles II's brother. And he converts to becoming a Roman Catholic in the 1670s, which is, as you may know, not very popular in Protestant England. So there's a huge political confrontation over whether he should be allowed to succeed to the throne after Charles, with the Tories essentially supporting him, even though they're not necessarily that keen on Roman Catholicism themselves. And the Whigs are supporting excluding him from the throne because they don't see that the monarchy and divine right and hereditary succession is as important as stopping a Roman Catholic becoming a king. This is because Roman Catholicism is seen as absolutist, foreign, and generally unacceptable. So that is the sort of where it kicks off, if you like. And then the first bout of this, which is kicked off by an extraordinary conspiracy theory called the Popish Plot, which is pushed by this sort of half-mad Protestant fanatic, and then ends up in all sorts of accusations of popery and a plot to kill the king and to take over the country. Eventually, this whole the Exclusion Crisis plays itself out, and it looks like the Whigs have got a good chance of winning and forcing the king to give up the Duke of York and allow somebody else to become heir to the throne. But in the end, Charles II turns the tables and defeats the Whigs. And the Whigs, many of them are forced to flee into exile, and some of them are executed for essentially treason. So the Tories, who are the supporters of the king, essentially win the first bout of this, the Exclusion Crisis. And then James II becomes king in 1685. However, it does not go well for him, at least, because it turns out that although he may not quite be the murderous papist authoritarian that people had thought, he nonetheless is quite keen on pushing Roman Catholicism to the people of England by appointing Roman Catholics to the army, which is not very popular, by appointing Roman Catholics to his government, and by actually promoting proselytizing in favour of Roman Catholicism and allowing this to happen. And this is very, very unpopular. And he soon loses the support not only of the Whigs, who always hated him, but the Tories as well, because he threatens the dominance of the Church of England, and particularly the High Church faction within the Church of England, which is the Tories' real base of support. And so he gets kicked out in the Glorious Revolution. And that's when a sort of second factor to the Glorious Revolution becomes incredibly important, which is that,
so you might want to explain just for a second what the Glorious Revolution is, because I think sometimes people confuse it with the Civil War.
Yes, well, the Glorious Revolution which happens in 1688 and then goes into 1689. Is a cross between an internal revolution and an external invasion. So James II becomes very unpopular. There are riots against popery because of his attempts to promote it. There's a lot of internal rebellion, but also there's a foreign aspect. So William of Orange, who is the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, which is sort of like the king, but not quite, he has a claim to the English throne. and he's crucially a Protestant. His claim is not very good. He's the grandson of Charles I, but more importantly, from his point of view, he has been fighting a long-standing war in Europe against Louis XIV, who is obviously the King of France, which is a sort of Catholic superpower of Europe at the time, and an aggressive superpower. So William of Orange he's anticipating another war with the Catholic French, and so basically he thinks, well, if I can come over, become king, get rid of James II, I can also get England's taxes, resources, armies to help me fight Louis XIV, which is a pretty good deal for him. So he comes over. He's invited by some English noblemen to come over and save them from the popish tyranny of James II, and he does. And after a lot of toing and froing, he becomes king. And the Tories are not happy about this particularly, but they accept it because to them, saving the Church of England is more important than maintaining strict hereditary succession and allowing James II, who is really Botany's copybook, even with the Tories. And so William of Orange becomes king. There are some people who don't accept this and who want James II to remain king, and they go into exile with James II, and they are known as the Jacobites, and they're sort of supported by the French for religious reasons because they're all Roman Catholics essentially. So you have the Jacobites, you have William of Orange becoming king as a sort of the Protestant wind blows, which allows William's navy to come over to England. There's not much fighting. James II gives up quite quickly. And so William becomes king, and then this is huge because this changes a massive amount of the party battle between Whig and Tory, because essentially the Tories are no longer that keen on the authority of the monarchy because he's not the hereditary monarch, he's not the anointed king in their view. What he is somebody who wants to increase taxes, produce a lot more debt, and the national debt emerges. And the Bank of England is founded at this time in the 1690s. And this means that the landed gentlemen are being taxed to fight a war against the French in Europe, which, in their view, benefits the Dutch.
Hello, I'm Bev Turner. Now, it can feel like the money in our bank accounts at the moment does not keep up with the cost of living. And maybe there's a solution. I'm here today with the CEO of TallyMoney, Cameron Parry. Cameron, what is TallyMoney?
Well, Bev, with TallyMoney, you get a current account and a debit card, but instead of pounds, you use milligrams of gold as your everyday money.
So why gold?
Gold traditionally is a great store of value. It has, on average, gone up at over 11% per annum for the last 25 years against the pound. It's tripled in value in the last decade, and in the last 2 years alone, it's increased by 50% against the pound. Banks' savings products just can't compete with that level of growth.
But this isn't just about gold. This is about a currency that you guys have created at TallyMoney. Explain it to me as though I'm an idiot.
So, look, people need to be able to hold their earnings and build their savings in a money that retains its value and remains in their legal control and remains theirs to access, away from government control.
Great. You had me at not exposed to government control.
You should feel safe and happy with your money. You should have peace of mind. The more money you see in your bank balance, and that's the type of thing we're trying to deliver, and give people choice in the type of money they get to use every day.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron. Thank you.
So the Tories are not that keen on this, and that changes the whole dynamic of the party war.
So you have, on the one hand, you have these Whig cosmopolitan types, and on the other, you have the Tory nationalists. You've described this in your book as being something of a culture war of its own time. And I think personally that this is an extremely interesting and fun period of our history. But I think many people don't know very much about it. A lot of the books that have been written about it, unlike yours, of course, which is an extremely fun read, many of the books that have been written about this are quite dry and academic. Why is this such an interesting and fun and still very relevant period of our history, in your view?
Well, it's fun at one level because you have some really big characters who are very highly coloured, and there's a lot of rakes who are, spending most of their time at Newmarket whilst they plot to in their political machinations. And so there's big characters like, for example, Thomas Wharton, who is one of the chief Whigs, who is a sort of notorious womanizer and horse racing enthusiast, and he also is a rather a dissolute character who gets in trouble because he relieves himself in a church when very drunk. He urinates on the altar and does the other type of the defecates in the pulpit, and this becomes a sort of long-standing element of the Tories see him as basically a sort of cross between like Satan and sort of the killers of Charles I. And so there are the big characters. Well, yeah, he's an interesting character, but I think it's the real interest of it in sort of more substantial terms, because there's a lot of womanising and duels. I mean, he fights 4 duels all against Tories and all that sort of thing, which I love. But I think it's also really interesting because it's England teetering on the edge of modernity in a way. So in some ways, it seems very foreign. It seems like, the 17th century, people killing people, hating each other over religious sectarianism, which now to many people seems a bit curious. But on the other hand, you have the emergence of all sorts of things which are very recognisable. So electoral politics, for a start, you get the first hint, you have the first party divisions, you get tumultuous election campaigns, you get people going out canvassing and being told, oh, we're all Whigs around here, or, and that sort of thing. So you can recognise some elements of, and there's also the first sort of dawning of something that resembles modern religious tolerance. So an important part of the Glorious Revolution is the passing of what becomes known as the Toleration Act, which allows Christians who are not churchmen, basically, but not Catholics, only Protestant dissenters, it allows them to legally exist, because they were technically illegal to be a Protestant dissenter before. And so this opens up a whole new world, which starts to be recognisably modern in a way that we would sort of recognise, but it still has the imprimatur of sort of a much older era. People beat each other senseless at election times with medieval weapons, and people get put in the Tower of London and almost executed because so there's a sort of like where the Tudor period is still in the background, but you're also getting into the 18th century to a world of trade, commerce, banking, and it was also interesting because it's a surprisingly vibrant era politically, in the sense that about a quarter of male adults had the vote, which obviously is not like a democratic era in the sense we would learn, but that's not nothing. Like a quarter of adults, a quarter of men having the vote, it means the people become a much more important factor in politics in a way that they'd never really done before. So for example, there's a massive expansion of newspapers and print and new satirists who are appealing to the people like Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe, who both play a major role in my book.
I was just going to say that I think, this period is very, like I said, very foggy. I think in people's imaginations, it's almost a sort of blank spot. People don't really get taught about this very important era when they're at school, for example, maybe even not if they're studying history at university in some places. And I think one of the things that your book does incredibly is that it makes it makes it apparent how relatable many of the figures in this period are. One of the things that you mention in your book is the Kit Kat Club, where the Whig leaders used to congregate. And you mentioned in there something that I thought was very amusing, which was that aside from their politics, the things that they bonded over were wine, attractive women and pies. And it is a very relatable period of our history. It's actually not really that distant from us, is it?
No, the cultural war element of it is very striking, and it goes into the crevices of almost all elements of life. You think nowadays, we've become quite politicised in all sorts of cultural areas. Well, this is not new. So in this period, everything from opera, which becomes a political battleground, through to what astrologer you consult, through to what doctor you visit, and even the postman. All of these things become part of the political battle. So they were called, and the Kit Kat Club is a good example. There's a bunch of rather dissolute Whigs who gather in a tavern, which the proprietor is famous for making delicious pies, so which is part of it. And they, amongst other things, they gather to basically drink heavily, and drinking heavily is still a part of politics, I think, in many cases, but it's certainly very much in evidence here. But one of the main things that they do, as well, and also having extravagant toasts to attractive women, which is always popular, but they also are massive sponsors of the stage. So the theatre becomes a massive site of political battle. So particularly the Whigs come to dominate the stage, and the Kit Kat Club are basically their patrons, and they actually set up a theatre not purely, but largely to propagate Whig propaganda plays, basically, called in the Haymarket. And so the theatre becomes a battleground for party politics. Everything becomes politicised, essentially. And, the women fight each other in the stalls. And there's a famous incident later on where there's a play where both sides try to claim, a play called Cato, which both sides try to claim as their own. And so you have Whigs on one side of the theatre, Tories on the other side of the theatre, cheering different lines because they have their own interpretations of what the play means. Basically, like sort of posh football hooligans cheering their team on, and this which is remarkable. And just finally, there's a famous passage from an essayist called Joseph Addison who describes how the ladies found different ways of putting face patch. So there's these things called face patches, which are basically designed to cover blemishes originally, because there's a lot of people with smallpox and stuff at this time. But and they're sometimes used as sort of aesthetic adornment. But the ladies, and a lot of the sort of ladies in high society, become very polarised along Whig and Tory lines, and they develop a sort of code where which part of your face you put it on designates whether you're Whig or Tory. And in their stalls at the opera, you can look at it and say, well, she's a Whig because she's got her face patch here, and she's a Tory because she's got it on here. So, culture wars are not new. In fact, I think much of politics is often a culture war, but it's particularly intense in this period. I think, and I mean, they hate each other. And why do they hate each other? Well, partly it's because they have sort of caricatures of what the other is like, so which is partly inflected by religion, but partly by more political reasons. But basically, the Whigs see the Tories as bigoted, mad squires who want the church to rule everything, and they try to also claim that they're not patriotic because they support the Jacobites, which they probably don't really. Whereas the Tories try to paint the Whigs as sort of regicide, atheist scoundrels who will kill the king or the queen, as it becomes, soon as look at them, and who are immoral and who like sort of carousing and doing all sorts of terrible deeds of adultery and whatever in private. So they really hate each other. I mean, if you think people hate each other on left and right now, well, it's not a new phenomenon.
Yeah, one of my favourite lines from your book is you quote this Tory poet satirist, and he characterises the Whigs as sleeping through the day and drinking through the night, and they sound like a lot of fun. But what is it about this period of history that you think is so important for people to read about now? I mean, you've written this brilliant new book. It's obviously something that you think people should know about. Why do you think it is so important that people understand this period of our political history?
Well, it's crucial because many of the institutions and many of the things that we now take for granted and that were hugely important in the subsequent history of Britain become founded or often as part of the party battle in this era. So, two obvious examples. One is the union between England and Scotland, which happens in 1707. Now, that is, as much as anything, the result of a party battle between Whig and Tory, because the Whigs essentially try to promote it because they think it helps the Protestant succession, and they also think that it will help them get more MPs and lords on their side because they have curried favour with the Scots. So basically, if you want to understand why the union with England and Scotland happened, this is which is obviously still been roiling our politics until quite recently with the referendums over independence, the SNP and so on. So there's one pretty good one. The other one is, this is the rise, and more importantly, this is the period where the Bank of England is founded. The national debt becomes a systematised major factor in our life. But this is because we're fighting numerous wars against the French, essentially. The whole English and then British state modernises. It becomes much larger. We develop ways of taxing and ways of organising military campaigns. we employ many more people to organise this, and this becomes a permanent factor in British political life. Without the ability, so the financial system essentially that develops allows Britain to borrow much more money, which is the means by which they become a great power ultimately in the 18th century. So, if you want to understand why the City of London is still a great force in our national life, why we became an empire later in the it starts in this era, but it develops importantly in this era. But if you're wondering why Britain becomes an imperial power in the 18th century, the later 18th century, the origins of it are here, because the financial system that funded the armies and the entire imperial infrastructure, the state which emerges, much more powerful state, and so on, that is a product of this era. So empire, the union with Scotland, and the subsequent history of all of that. But to understand that, you need to understand this era. And finally, I would say that the cultural divides, which are crucial to the politics of this era, are still there. They still echo it. So in the Brexit debate, you had clearly echoes of what was essentially a Tory sort of nationalism versus a Whig cosmopolitanism. So, the Tories' attitude during this period is essentially, why are we funding a war in Europe we don't really benefit from, and why are we being taxed to intervene in the affairs of Europe? Why, it's not none of our business. It's a forever war that we won't benefit from. Whereas the Whigs' view was very much, well, we are part of Europe and we need to intervene to help our Protestant co-religionists. And we can't isolate ourselves from the affairs of Europe. We need to be at the heart of Europe, and so on. And if you can't hear the echoes of that, hundreds of years later in the Brexit debate, these things, although they're not couched in explicitly religious terms anymore, their cultural imprint of that divide is still with us. I think if you want to understand the rise of reform and the travails of the Labour and Conservative parties, then the cultural divides from this era probably are not a bad place to start.
Yeah, I think people forget that they live in history. The famous phrase, the end of history. I think people believe that we live at the end of history, and they forget how much we're living in the country that was created by our ancestors. And actually this period of history is altogether not that long ago. Thank you so much for joining us today, George. Just quickly before we end the interview, what is the date that the book is published?
The book is published on the 4th of September, and so available in all good bookshops. So I hope some people enjoy it.
Everybody should go and buy a copy. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading it. So thank you again so much, George, for joining us. And don't forget to subscribe, put your views in the comments, and download our app in order to stay up to date with all of our content. We'll see you next time.